Readers have often said that my novels do a very good job of hooking them and making it impossible for them to put down the book. So in this video, I'll be sharing my 6-step process for helping you immediately hook your readers on page 1 of your story so that they don't want to put your book down. To show these principles in action, I'll also be helping Michael, who is a young writer who is just sort of starting out in his author journey, improve his opening pages. What would you say you're struggling with the most?
Everything.
I actually had 18 writers send in their opening pages to me after I put up a link in my community section. So thank you to all you brave souls for contributing. I read through a lot of your stories, and the 6 steps I'm about to share in this video actually come from seeing the kind of common mistakes that kept cropping up in all of these stories. Step number 1, start with the story in miniature. So I have this theory that good openings are basically openings where the author understands what the entire story is about, and then they compress it down into almost like a short story version of their wider narrative. So a classic example here is the opening of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of my favorite movies of all time. The wider film is about a plucky archaeologist who is basically navigating all these dangerous traps and figuring out pathways through these different myths and legends in order to find these treasures and keep them safe from people who would seek to exploit them for power or for money. Now, the opening gives you that entire structure just compressed down into a short 10-minute version. Why is this so effective? Well, by having a kind of distinct opening scene like this with a very clear beginning, middle, and end, it shows your readers that you know how to structure a cohesive narrative. You're earning their trust. It's also the best way to clearly establish your tone and the kind of style of the story. If readers like this little opening sample you're giving them, then they're probably going to enjoy the rest of the novel as well. This is actually something that Michael did quite well on his opening page, which I'll link to in the description if you want to check that out. Michael has written a fantasy story about these 2 sibling thieves set in a floating Asian-inspired city. Like most people in this world, these 2 thieves have these stars on the palms of their hands that give them different elemental abilities.
You have done a really great job of capturing the story in miniature with your opening here. You know, your story opens with 2 thieves that are escaping from a burning mansion after their mission goes wrong. And that's pretty much like what your story is about on a thematic level as a whole. It doesn't always have to be like a one-to-one thing where you make it an exact copy of your wider story, but it's more about just like showing readers, hey, this is what you can expect. This is the type of story that I'm going to write for you. The way that you could take this to an even bigger level is to really try to express some of the kind of wider themes that your story is exploring in this opening.
Step number 2, show a character with agency, uniqueness, and momentum. Agency means your character is doing something that progresses them towards their goal. Uniqueness means that they are making decisions and choices that 95% of other characters wouldn't make. And then lastly, momentum means that they are in the process of pursuing something interesting. They're not just standing around waiting for the story to happen. That doesn't mean they have to be physically pursuing their goals, like a chase scene or something. They could also be verbally or kind of emotionally trying to pursue something as well. For example, a character trying to get a job. Now, why these 3 traits? Well, I think these 3 traits are really important because the goal of the opening is to really get your readers invested in your character as quickly as possible. And having a character with agency, uniqueness, and momentum is a really good shortcut for getting readers interested in what they're doing.
When it comes to your story, like you've nailed the momentum aspect with 9, because we're thrown literally into the middle of a burning building while she's doing her heist. And the uniqueness aspect also comes across quite well when she's talking about, oh, it's so annoying how buildings always catch fire when I'm in them.
Yeah.
That was really great. I like that. What I think you've done here really well is like personality-based uniqueness. I'd love to also see some action-based uniqueness. You're playing this to a small extent with how she's a little bit reckless later. It would be good if you can emphasize that a bit more to show that like this is a character who's going to do actions and responses that are sort of different to most other characters in the story.
Step 3, explore meaningful internal conflict within your character. In a movie, you can have a great opening just with physical action. Now, you can try to do that in a book as well, but it won't be as effective because you don't have the visuals and the music and the other unique elements of film to rely upon. Instead, if you really want to hook readers, it's so important to quickly introduce meaningful internal conflict within a character. What are they struggling against? What desires are competing within them? What tensions are threatening to tear them apart? So agency, uniqueness, and momentum, these are all really important to start the process of hooking readers. But in order to actually cement that hook and get readers fully invested for the next 10 hours of their life, you really need to be moving towards showing some meaningful internal conflict and struggle within your character.
I would say this is probably the one area where your opening falls down the most at the moment. Aside from 9 being kind of annoyed that buildings always catch fire around her, which is good, she feels a little blank in these opening pages. Can you add a few extra sentences to show why the heist is so important to her? What happens if she fails to steal this item? You really need to make that something that readers feel invested in.
I definitely think bringing up, her father and the reason that she's doing these criminal activity. It's really her biggest fear, I think.
Step 4, raise interesting questions. Ultimately, what you want to be doing with the opening couple of pages in your novel is opening a bunch of question loops where you raise a question and then a bit later on you answer it. That is a complete loop. Now, you want to have a combination of kind of long question loops throughout your novel. For example, you might have a murder that takes place at the start of the book that doesn't get resolved, doesn't get answered, and the question loop closed until the end of the novel. However, it's also important to have some shorter question loops so that you can continuously give readers the sense of progression and payoff. You can kind of think of question loops as having 3 distinct parts. There is the promise, which is when the question is set up. There is the progression, where the characters work towards finding an answer. And then there is the payoff, where the answer is revealed. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to introduce the overall question arc of your story right away. In fact, it's usually quite an effective technique to spend the first 25% of your novel using shorter question loops just to get readers invested enough so that then you can actually unload on them with the true question that your story is about. A really good example of this is the first Harry Potter book. You don't really get to the wider questions of the story until about the end of part 1, 25% of the way through. But in the opening couple of chapters, Rowling basically gives us a bunch of smaller question loops like, why is Harry getting all of these weird letters? And it's basically using these smaller question loops as a way to just quickly draw readers in, giving them the sense of progression and payoff by answering these questions in a relatively rapid span of time. And then that gets us to the wider question of, once he's at Hogwarts, how's he going to deal with life there? One of the advanced techniques that I would recommend with your question loops is to really consider what questions readers are interested in for your genre. So for example, in fantasy, usually readers are very interested in the magic and the world and maybe like the politics. So you should be raising questions that sort of pique readers' interest in those categories. Step 5, start late, leave early. Don't start with the character waking up, like having breakfast, brushing their teeth, walking outside, and then getting attacked. Just start with them getting attacked. Begin in the instant that the ordinary world is disrupted and that things start changing. And then the instant that your opening scene can be finished, wrap it up. The Dark Knight is a perfect example of this. It starts right when a bank heist begins. It doesn't show 10 minutes of preparation beforehand. It just gets right into the action. And then it ends just after promising us that we're going to see this brilliant, cunning villain in the form of the Joker.
Whatever doesn't kill you simply makes you stranger.
This is something Michael's story did really well. He literally starts with the main character stumbling out of a burning room in a building that she's trying to steal something from, and it ends like the instant that she jumps out of that building. Step number 6, craft curiosity with your opening line. When you write your first draft, I don't think you should worry about your opening line that much. Once you are coming back to edit, I think you should seriously spend hours on that first line, because the fact is that the majority of readers are not going to give your book more than 10 to 15 seconds. So if you're not hooking them and giving a first impression right away in that first sentence, they're probably going to move on to something else. However, saying that, you don't just want to have a gimmicky first line. In fact, some of the greatest opening lines I've read just get straight to the point. They don't worry about being clever, they just throw you into the story. For example, the opening line of Red Dragon, which is the first Hannibal Lecter novel, goes something like this. Will Graham sat Crawford down at a picnic table between the house and the ocean and gave him a glass of iced tea. Simple, no pretension, just gets the story moving right away. Basically, what you want to do with your opening line is take all the previous 5 steps I've mentioned and compress them down into the space of that opening line or your opening couple of sentences. And in fact, if you follow the previous 5 steps in order, you'll probably find that your opening line almost takes care of itself. To give an example from my own book, Across the Broken Stars, Leon hated Varian airships, but since unloading them put beers on his table, he faked a smile as he picked up the crate. Here you can see the opening line follows all the previous steps that I've discussed. It shows the whole story in miniature because Leon is basically having to hide his true nature from the Varians who have colonized his nation. Number 2, he's got agency. Even though he is sort of working for someone else, he is actually doing something physically. Number 3, he's got uniqueness because, he is actually having thoughts that are very different to his actions. He's also got momentum because he's like actually doing a thing. He's not just sitting around thinking. And then lastly, he's got meaningful internal conflict. He hates and despises the Varians, but still has to work for them and kind of resents himself for having to do this. It also goes without saying that you need to put a ton of effort into making your opening line as grammatically perfect and easy to read and as flowing as possible. There are 0 excuses for typos here. So applying that to Michael's story, here is what he initially wrote down in his opening lines. 9 Eleanor gagged through smoke that she absolutely did not create. Staying low, young flames licked her back as she dashed from the burning room. Why did buildings always have to catch fire when she was inside them? It wasn't her fault. I suggested changing that to this. 9 staggered out of the burning room, gagging on the smoke. Flames licked her back as she fell into the hallway. Why did houses always have to catch fire when she was inside them? Hopefully what you can see there is it flows a bit better, it's a bit more active, and we immediately start with a bit more momentum because 9 is staggering right away from the very first sentence.
That just blew my mind. So I'm gonna be thinking about that a lot.
So those are my 6 steps to craft a great opening page that hooks your readers. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you might like this one. Cheers, and I'll see you in the next video.